Hello, everyone, and welcome to our coverage on The Hive. Easily the species in Destiny with the most lore covering them, a search for the Hive returns 27 pages of results on Ishtar Collective. I've saved them for last, as they have interactions with every other species in the game, and I was forced to take notes for them while I researched anything else. To keep this video approachable in any sense, I had to limit what I covered here, but I attempted to focus on the more important details that form the Hive into what we know them as today, elevated from their beginnings as a prey species. We'll be discussing their history on Fundament, then transitioning into more relatively current events like our interactions with Crota, the machinations behind the Scarlet Keep, and the Lucent Brood. Without further ado, let's get right into it. The Hive were originally known as Krill, a numerous yet frail species existing on a gas giant called Fundament. For much of Krill history, they believed themselves to be amongst the lowest prey species on the planet, referring to it as the Timid Truth. Not only were they prey to hunter species like Stormjoys, they also suffered raiding parties who demanded sacrifice from the Osmium dynasty. The Helium Drinkers were their rivals, and the siblings that we know had in fact lost many other siblings to these sacrifices. The homeworld of the Krill is not Fundament, however, though it is where the Hive were born. The actual Krill planet is revealed to have crashed into Fundament long ago, creating the very floating continents they lived on. Discovering this, the Osmium siblings began to seek out a new power to take for themselves, to reassert themselves in the structure of the universe. Meanwhile, the ruler of the Osmium dynasty had lived an extremely long life for a Krill, and was perceived to be slipping into senility. Not seeing a bright future in the remaining heirs, the tutor for the siblings, Teox, sent message to the Helium Drinkers, plotting a hostile takeover in return for being granted regency. With their kingdom in shambles, the trio of siblings made their escape, carrying only their father's dead familiar with them. Using their burning anger as a point of corruption, the Dark whispered their influence to the Krill. In order to exact their revenge and take back their home, they were encouraged to go deeper, down to the depths of Fundament, and seek a power truly meant for them. Taking the worm larvae into themselves, a bargain was struck. Immortality and power in return for an insatiable appetite for death and destruction. Conquering the many civilizations of Fundament, they began to amass the technology and knowledge to escape their terrestrial prison. Climbing first to the moons of Fundament, they engaged in battle with the Ammonite and utterly destroyed them, taking from them the resources they needed to further expand the new Hive Empire out into the stars. Teox, the traitorous actor responsible for the betrayal and downfall of the Osmium dynasty, managed to escape Fundament and even assisted other civilizations in their future wars with the Hive. Despite each of these civilizations falling, Teox is rumored to have managed to escape again and again. Her whereabouts are unknown, but given the Krill's life expectancy without the worms, it's reasonable to assume she no longer lives. While the Books of Sorrow are a long history of the Hive, it is clearly a subjective work of history. And as we've come to learn later, there are many truths that have been obfuscated here. After the Vow of the Disciple raid, we come to learn of the perspective of Great Worm God Mother Zaita. It was not the worms who had conceived to subjugate the Krill. It was in fact Rulk, who desired to convert them to an army for the Witness and take the worm's power for himself. Living pieces were shorn from Zaitha, and the larvae were sent to the shores of the Osmium dynasty. Zaitha was taken away from Fundament for use in further plans of Rolx, leaving behind her children, the ones we knew as the Hive's worm gods. While we always knew the sword logic was essentially a pyramid scheme, we can now see the original source of this tithing. The worm gods are in fact not all-powerful and supreme in the deep. They are just another servant to a higher power. During the Season of the Deep, we learn even more about the truth of the supposed worm gods. Asa, the great mysterious creature of Titan that confounded the community since the early days of Destiny 2, is revealed to be a proto-species to the worm gods. Having turned away from the promises of the darkness, Asa fled persecution and desired sanctuary. Through Asa's binding with Sloane and Eris, she effects her retribution for her fallen brethren. By using the very power that corrupted and twisted the worms into gods of the darkness, she would help to destroy their violent legacy and bring at least a modicum of decorum to their memory. What we learned only several billion years too late is that the Traveler had actually arrived with intent to uplift the Krill into the light, but the darkness chose to manipulate them instead. Spurred on by their newfound power of the dark, they forced the rest of the Krill to either take on worm larvae as well, or die, effectively subjugating the Krill into a fanatical army to wield in its war against the Traveler. As they spread out through the galaxy, the Hive continued to develop their understanding of the deep, establishing their superiority through conquest and absolute decimation. At varying points in their crusade, each of the siblings seemed to face moments of weakness or uncertainty, only to be set back on the path again by the other two, violently. The worm gods felt the heel of the Witness, the Hive felt the hunger of the worms, and the universe was made to feel the blade of the Hive. At one particular system of note, the Ecumene faced down the Hive and managed to resist them at every turn. After being rebuked so utterly that Aurix admits they fear leaving their throne world for fear of being killed even more, the siblings conspire a new plan for power. While Xivu sacrifices herself for Aurix's growth, Savathun attempts to trick Aurix, only to be slaughtered as well. Using the new power obtained through the sword logic in slaying such powerful entities as their siblings, Aurix takes to the dark to confer with his god Akka. Unaffected by the worm's lies, Aurix kills the worm god, taking even more power for himself. Continuing through the dark, Aurix is greeted by the voice behind the deep, being granted the power to take. By removing the will of the target with the strength of his own, a creature is brought to the deep, and their imperfections made perfect, typically resulting in a more violent and subservient version of itself. With this ability carved into tablets at his waist, Aurix is once more transformed, becoming Oryx, the Taken King. Consuming the forces of the Ecumene and turning them to fight for the Hive, the tide of war quickly begins to turn. Tactics and technological superiority are no longer a match for the ever-increasing weight of forces against a dwindling defense. Through this absolute execution of war and battle, Xivu Arath is born again, her essence being mantled through the very existence of war. However, since Oryx is also the king of knowledge and understanding, the war was not merely won through movement and combat, but through subterfuge and tactic as well. The Ecumene were left lost as their strategies simply no longer held value. Confusion was rife as soldiers disappeared from rank. And thus, Savathun, the god of trickery, was born anew. The Ecumene were no more, and the remaining ruins of their once expansive civilization were left to be devoured by the Horde. Moving on to more recent history, I'd like to touch on some of the more important events that took place in-game, but are locked back in D1 or are lacking context in Destiny 2. Some events have been touched up, like the Omnigul Navoda strike, but I'll be focusing on more nebulous topics than specific missions. Keeping mostly in chronological order, we'll begin with the story of humanity's interaction with Crota. Starting with the first and only amassing of an army-sized Guardian offensive, then the fated Fireteam's failed raid on the Hellmouth, and finally, the death of Crota by our own Player Guardians raid team. During the early days of the city, there were rumors of devils and ghouls that prowled the moon. As speculation ran rampant, terrifying ships began to rain down across Earth, and literal demons seemed to pour from them. A great battle known as Burning Lake took place, where Guardians were felled in final deaths by swords bathed in dripping darkness. Sending out a call to all Guardians, a force of thousands gathered to respond and take the demon's base on the moon and cease the offensive on Earth. Despite the pleading of Shaxx, who had seen the devastation of Burning Lake firsthand, these Guardians were sent to their doom. As the Guardians began to make slow advances across the pale rocky moon, a shadow swept out across the forces and a tremor ripped through Luna. Crota, the Eater of Hope, had come to rend these poor fools of their light. In an event remembered as the Great Disaster, nearly every Guardian had their very souls ripped from them, the survivors returning with such horror stories that the Vanguard responded by restricting access to the moon. Any who traveled to Luna did so without support. In the wake of this disaster, a hunter known as Ariana III was distraught, wanting revenge for her fallen lover, Wei Ning, felled by Crota himself. Enlisting the help of like-minded Guardians, they traveled back to the moon, determined to exact revenge. Each of these Fireteam members are significant in their own right, but most important for this summary of events are those known as the Warlock Toland and the Hunter Eris Morn. Toland was brought onto the team despite their reservations, as no one else in the city held as much knowledge of the Hive and their arcana as he did. Unfortunately, they failed to gauge just how fanatically he was dedicated to obtaining this knowledge, ultimately being abandoned and potentially even sacrificed intentionally to gain these secrets. Toland was solely focused on learning about what is known as the Death Song, and ended up experiencing it for himself. As the rest of the fire team were also left to their unfortunate fates, one member managed to crawl and scrape her way to survival. Eris Morn lost her light in the caverns of Luna, both her visible sight as well as the light of her ghost. Using an Ahamkara's bone to her favor, she still had to suffer alone amongst the hive for years, until VIP 2014 opened the gates and allowed her to escape. Under the tutelage of Eris and all that she learned while trapped on the moon, we gather a new fire team and storm Luna for the retribution of all of our fallen comrades. Crippling the fledgling god, we take control of the very sword used to wreak such devastation, and cut down the former demon in his own throne world, bringing an end to his reign for good. As nothing is without consequence, however, the death of Crota sends shockwaves through the hive hierarchy, and we are brought to feel the wrath of the taken king, Oryx, himself. By continuing our strategy of targeting the tithing structure, so essential to the strength of the hive, we again managed to bring low this once great force of supernatural power, reducing this puny god to drifting flotsam in Saturn's gravity. While we in the city were focused on dealing with this main pillar of the hive, on the sidelines were several conspiracies positioning themselves to make a grab for the resulting power vacuum we would leave. Nokris, the heretical son of Oryx, known amongst the hive by only a single solitary statue, was weak by strength, but had a deft and agile mind. Having turned to sacrilegious practices like necromancy, Oryx disowned his son, casting him out. In his isolation, Nokris discovered a similar cast-out worm god, weak and soon to be preyed on by their siblings. Together, they conspired to create their own dynasty and assert their dominance over the brutish ways of the hive. But their ambitions were brought to an end by none other than our own player guardian. Nearby the Hellmouth on the moon was the Scarlet Keep, a stronghold built deep into the caverns of Luna where the schemers and collaborators gathered to try to assume control. Performing their own secret rituals they wished to keep secret from the main horde, many different aspirations gathered here and wrestled for dominance. While we did directly play a hand in crippling several of the conspiracies within the Scarlet Keep, there was no shortage of sabotage and outside influence, that it ultimately fell to infighting and as a husk of its former purpose. Most significantly in the last few years was the discovery of Savathun and her brood of Lucent Hive. While recent discoveries tell us that the Traveler had always meant to uplift the Krill, at the time it was an absolutely devastating revelation that left many in the city questioning the virtue of the war we had all been fighting for centuries. Crushing the first hive ghost in our hands was a troubling and visceral experience, but we soon learned that just as we wielded the dark without being corrupted, not all light-bearers were on our side. As we learned more and more about the history of events, we built up a tenuous allyship with some surprising players, though none more surprising than Savathun herself. Despite this newfound friendship, we know we have been betrayed and lied to by her, and we ourselves have attempted to manipulate her, and even outright killed her numerous times. Sometimes for a purpose, sometimes for individual satisfaction. The Hive are easily one of the most storied species in all of Destiny, surprisingly, even more so than our own humanity. While I've tried to make this as comprehensive of an overarching history, there are many more important events that I never even touched on. The Hive's battle with the Harmony, the Awoken slaughter by the Hive over Saturn, Xivu's cultivation of the Wrathborn, and so many others. This brings an end to our series on the main species of the Destiny universe. I want to thank you very much for coming along for these summaries. As this is the end, I just want to address a couple questions you might have about what I did or didn't cover, and why. There are numerous important battles or events that I glossed over, or more likely, didn't touch on at all. For some of these, it was intentional, as I have plans on covering them much more in depth in a future series. Though if you have a favorite that I missed, please be sure to mention it so I can make sure to cover it. Why didn't I cover the Scorn or the Taken? Kind of two answers, though similar question. For the Scorn, while I think they are significantly different from the Eliksni, they simply are too recent in their creation to have much of a recorded history. I am hoping we get more in-depth look at them during the episode Revenant, and if so, I'll do a full episode on them then. For the Taken, well, they really aren't their own culture enough to distinguish them from whatever species they were stolen from, so I just briefly touched on them here in the Hive episode. That'll do it for this week's episode. Coming up for the next few weeks, I plan on taking a break from covering Destiny, as we take a look back on some of my personal favorite retro titles. And to start with, one that might break your heart to be considered retro, but it is. We'll be covering the story of Halo: Combat Evolved. I've got at least a handful of titles I plan on covering, ranging anywhere from original PlayStation to Game Boy Advance, to who knows where. I'll put out a poll in the coming days to see if there's anything y'all want to suggest, but as always, feel free to drop it in the comments below. Thanks for hanging out. Have a good one.